Um, I I had invitations very often to other parts of Indonesia, and then I couldn't fit Aceh in. I did a lot of my traveling was very intense because I wanted to make the center visible, and so I would go fly back and forth, rather quickly. I'd go and do a program or a conference, and then immediately go back home. But I've always been fascinated reading about Aceh.
Yeah. Do come to Aceh if you have any planning to go to Southeast Asian countries. We can have you in person
You know,
in Aceh.
well, one of I think one of the real areas that I regret, as I said, and it made it weak, was to be in Indonesia multiple times, but never to go to Aceh, given the significance of Aceh historically, intellectually, etc. It's
Professor Imtiaz visited us, I think, one time on we had a seminar on Persian a few
Yeah,
years
yeah, I
ago. Yeah.
remember that. Yeah.
What's interesting is that I have more of my books and even my encyclopedia uh, translated into Bahasa than into Arabic. And part of that is that Arabs are not really great readers historically, as a generalization. I wouldn't want to be quoted on that outside of in the Arab world, but that's just the case.
Oh, we have 20 students still join. We have Mr. Nasir Jamil, professor. He's the member of parliament in Indonesia, still active now in Jakarta. Yeah, Mr. Nasir Jamil. Could you say something, Pak Nasir Jamil?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Very glad yeah. Professor John Esposito, often I read your book. Yeah. But translate to Indonesia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, one time I was in one of the times I was in Malaysia when Anwar Ibrahim was the deputy prime minister. He then came to Georgetown to speak. I'd known him for about 40 years, but in front of an audience, he turned and said, "Gee, John, I'm sorry to tell you that one of your books was just banned in Kuala Lumpur."
Yeah. Many of you students here, Professor Jones, who like read your books when they were student in their first or master degree in Yogyakarta, in Jakarta, or even in Aceh. So they knew you quite well. When I informed them about you that we join our webinars, so that also but still, like bringing the spirit of legend in Islamic studies for us now in Aceh.
Set this
Dr. Samsul Bahri for Yasir Khan at the Harmansyah. Yes. Yes.
I'm cooking and listening, so you go ahead.
Okay, I will begin in 2 minutes, and then we listen to our great professor John, and people will join us. Like editors, and then I already recorded in our computer here, so we can upload it to our YouTube channel in Indonesia, so people can follow Professor John's lectures.
Yeah, I listen already. Yeah.
Yes. Shall we begin, Professor John?
Say that again.
Shall we begin the?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So shall I start speaking or?
Yeah, I will introduce you first and then you
good.
start
Yeah.
your lectures. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I know some of you in the early morning, very good morning, good afternoon, and good night for us in Indonesia. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Tonight we will have international public lectures by our Professor John L. Esposito. We know him as our legends in Islamic studies, and we read his books, some in English and also some in Bahasa. And he just mentioned that some of his book also in Malay. So we knew him quite like give us the spirit in Islamic studies. And tonight he will talk about Islamophobia, about the fiction or imagined concept. And before we listen to his lectures, allow me to read his short bio that he sent it to me this morning Indonesian time, and then that will follow by his talk on Islamophobia. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor John S. L. Esposito is distinguished university professor, professor of religion and international affairs and of Islamic studies at Georgetown University. John L. Esposito is founding director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and the Bridge Initiative Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia in World School of Foreign Service. Past president of the American Academy of Religion and Middle East Studies Association of North America. Esposito has been a member of the World Economic Forum Council of 100 leaders at the EC European Network on Expert on the Radicalizations, a senior scientist for the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, and an ambassador for UN Alliance of Civilization. He has served as a consultant to U.S. Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian government, corporation, university, and media worldwide. Esposito, more than 55 books. I know you read his book, Sharia, What Everyone Needs to Know, with Natana Dillon Bass, Islam and Democracy After Arab Spring, etc. Many of his books you can find about him in search engine. And Alhamdulillah, tonight we have Professor John Esposito with us, and he will deliver on the concept of Islamophobia. I think that all from me. And Alhamdulillah, very, very shukran. Terima kasih, mohon syukriya for you, Professor John, from the state join us this morning from the New York. And now time is yours, Professor Jam. Please.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. I'm happy to be talking to you today. While often overlooked, the origins and roots of modern forms of Islamophobia in the West have taken a number of shapes and approaches. But I just wanted to make a couple of brief comments. In terms of global Islamophobia, actually, I just have a book that just came out with Oxford University Press called Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism. It has case studies from around the world. But let me begin by saying that from the US and Europe to the Middle East and Asia, sadly today in Israel and Gaza, in the war and in this war and genocide, and in media reporting, Islamophobia, discrimination and violence against Muslims is now an ugly worldwide phenomenon. American and European domestic and foreign policies and politics and the notion of a global war on terrorism, which began during the Bush administration, have played a major role in the growth of Islamophobia, both in the West and internationally. Today, the biggest crises of Islamophobia now exists not only in the Western world, but outside the Western world, with genocides against the Uyghurs in China and the Rohingya in Myanmar, alongside the dangerous growth of Islamophobia in India under the Modi government, which is being covered a great deal, and in much of the current language and positions in the current conflict and genocide in Palestine, that is in Gaza and the West Bank. But let's talk very briefly about the origins of modern Islamophobia. Islamophobia has existed way back when, I mean, for centuries. But in terms of modern Islamophobia, while it's often overlooked, the origins and roots of modern forms of Islamophobia shape the attitudes and government policies towards Islam and Muslims, influencing the current globalization of Islamophobia. But, and I would emphasize this, prior to the Iranian Revolution, in general in the West, certainly in the United States, for example, Islam and Muslims were invisible. What I mean by that is that people were identified by the country that they came from. So you might say to somebody, oh, you're from Egypt, you're from Indonesia, etc. Rather than emphasizing, as it were, the religion of people. Also, in many Western countries, and certainly this was true in the US, mosques were very few and therefore invisible to the average person. When I began to study Islam, there were only a couple of mosques in the United States. So prior to the Iranian Revolution then, Islam and Muslim politics were also reflected its invisibility in professional organizations like the American Academy of Religion. Islam was not even covered in the American Academy of Religion until the early 1980s, when Ismail Al-Faruqi and those of us who were graduate students became involved. And this was also true for the Middle East Studies Association. It was invisible in the training of diplomats until the 1980s, and those in the military. In education, in schools, colleges, and universities, with the exception of a few universities, it was invisible and also very much invisible in the media. When I finished my PhD in 1974, there were no jobs. Ismail Al-Faruqi, when I mentioned that to him, colleagues had told me that ahead of time. You're taking a degree and you'll probably never be able to get a job in it. So Ismail said to me, well, he could help me by having me go to Gaddafi's Libya or apartheid South Africa. Now, that was neither attractive to me, but I kind of wanted to say my parents would never understand why I got a PhD and was going off to Gaddafi's Libya, for example. But this all changed dramatically with the Iranian Revolution. As I've often said, I owe my career, excuse me, and my first Lexus car to the Iranian Revolution. So no career, and then with the Iranian Revolution, all kinds of possibilities: publishing, speaking, jobs, etc., consulting. Iran's Islamic Revolution and the resurgence of Islam also in Muslim politics, society, and culture from the Middle East to Southeast Asia was totally unexpected. And I followed that at that period of time in the 70s and into the 80s and wrote about it, where it wasn't just the Iranian Revolution, but it was also the fact that people began to notice as a result of that Islam was playing a role in Muslim societies and Muslim politics, the growth of Islamic movements, Islamic candidates, etc. So Khomeini's call to export the revolution, of course, became the lens through which many Western and global governments and many of their citizens who knew nothing else about Islam and Muslims now encountered Islam and Muslims. So basically, the lens was, this is a religion you know nothing about, and yet when you put your TV on during the Iranian Revolution, every day you would see tens of thousands of people chanting death to Islamic fundamentalism. It became heavily covered all of a sudden in the news. But again, remember, it wasn't what mainstream Islam or what mainstream Muslims were about, but rather what militant or extremist actions were about. We saw this concern and what it led to with this notion of a clash of civilizations between the West and the Muslim world. But long before Professor Samuel Huntington, who was at Harvard at the time, before his warning of a clash of civilizations, Edward Said warned and predicted a decade before, in 1981, right after the revolution, that in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, he predicted what would to come. And I quote him here: "For the general public in America and Europe today, Islam is news of a particularly unpleasant sort. The media, the government, the geopolitical strategists, and although they are marginal to the culture at large, academic experts on Islam are all in concert saying Islam is a threat to Western civilization." Now, more than 10 years later, you then had an article appear in a very important journal called Foreign Affairs, and then a book from that article called The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington, a professor at Harvard. He argued that, excuse me again, that after the Cold War, conflicts over cultural and religious identity would dominate global politics. And he said, and this is specifically a quote from him, "Islam has bloody borders and bloody innards." It's the very innards, or inside, as it were, of Islam is bloody. Okay, bloody borders, bloody innards. That was followed then by the notion of Islam as a triple threat, Statements by Western policymakers and media commentators increasingly warned of an Islamic threat. And it was a triple threat to the West: political threat, a civilizational threat, and a demographic threat. As it were, the Muslims are coming, a demographic threat. So all of a sudden, awareness that we have more and more Muslims, or here we have many coming into the country. And that notion of a triple threat, political, civilizational, and demographic, fed a notion of an impending clash of civilizations, which was quite dominant. I remember when his book came out, he and I did programs together. We actually debated in Saudi Arabia. But I remember I had people in Muslim countries like Malaysia and others saying to me, figuring that I knew Sam Huntington really well, "Oh, we want to have him out here. We want to hear what he has to say." It isn't just West governments that were looking at growth of having 11 attacks. So yeah, revolution, but it's the 9/11 attacks of the World Trade Center, which shocked everybody globally. The idea that both would be brought down, would be blown up, as it were, and the Pentagon would also be attacked by Al-Qaeda. In Europe and across the world, to Bali, Indonesia, the attention of people globally, governments and people. Later, the successful spread of the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria, that built on this notion of 9/11, and then, sometime later, the idea of not only Al-Qaeda, but then the Islamic State, and its initial success in Iraq and Syria. And then, as a result of all of this, the mass immigration to the West of Muslims, that is, to the West in terms of Germany, Britain, and then the United States, fueled the rise of the far right and white nationalism. So far right politics, not central politics, far right and white nationalism of many of these countries, because these countries were in their history white, white nations, as it were. And suddenly you had a significant number of people who were different in terms of their look, their name, their color, as it were, and their religion. And their religion, for many, as a result of what was going on in the world, I just referred to Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and then also the media's focus on that, as opposed to what the vast majority of Muslims were like. all of that affected American and European Islamophobia and affected its politics. Islam and Muslims, not just extremists and terrorists, therefore, were cast and in many cases demonized as the radical other in Western media and society. The US-driven global war on terrorism and that notion of global war on terrorism, which then extended for many years after al-Qaeda, with all its rhetoric, policies, and actions, including then the invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, attempting to justify that, the US Patriot Act, Guantanamo Bay, would ultimately lead to all of those phenomena would lead to the globalization of Islamophobia. Now, this phenomenon spread, though, far beyond the borders of the West to the Muslim world, as well as non-Muslim Asian countries, such as India, Myanmar, and China. The victims were not just a small minority of Muslim extremists and terrorists, but also, and more broadly, the very faith and identity of mainstream majority of Muslims, of the mainstream majority of Muslims. One can say that, for example, after 9/11, I've been asked to brief the current president of the United States, Joe Biden. He was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee. And it was clear when I met with him that he and many of the members of the Senate really were not really aware of, if you will, the Middle East and the Muslim world. They focused mainly on Europe. They focused on Russia, or they might focus on China. But they would leave the coverage or understanding of the Middle East and the Muslim world to a staff member. And so the very policymakers weren't aware of it. There was actually a study done by an article that was written by somebody who wrote for the congressional record, as it were, and he interviewed some of the top members of the Senate and of Congress. That is, of the committees that dealt with politics, extremism, or terrorism, all of those. So in other words, a lot of these top people. And the question that he asked them was, did they know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia? And invariably, virtually every one of these leaders, so it was a small group, but they were leaders of the major committees, et cetera, in Congress, got the question wrong. That is, they could not tell the difference between a Sunni and a Shia, and yet they were involved in policy and policy making. Now, a major force also has been mass media. Mass media, not just print, but especially social media over the years, have played a critical role in the spread of Islamophobia, providing a platform for anti-Islam and anti-Muslim statements by political and religious leaders, by media commentators, and a host of what I call preachers of hate. As the old media adage goes, if it bleeds, it leads. This is a notion in terms of sales of not only newspapers, but also coverage in media, TV media, as well as mass media. The idea that if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, catastrophes are what stand out. And so therefore, the emphasis, when there was coverage of Islam and Muslims in the Muslim world, the emphasis would be on what are the headline events? What groups are there that are engaged in an anti-government or extremism overseas, and also might then be a threat to the West. And so that fed this situation. This was particularly true of what I would call the explosion of social media. It was around this time that you began to see, for example, a number of us, after 9/11, you had Campus Watch, which then ranked, as it were, what were seen as dangerous professors. I'm delighted to say I was in the first tier on that. And you have had other groups. Today you have a Canary Mission. You can look that up on the internet. It used to be a limited number of people. Now there's an overwhelming number of people, particularly driven by, more recently, what's going on in Gaza. But the role of social media should be, really seen as extremely important, far more important than print media. When I was growing up in my early career, news was what you saw in the newspapers and you saw on television. Social media, as you know, allows people to get out and get their message out to hundreds of millions of people. So these social media websites. And what one begins to see when you do research, and we've in this group that I found created within the center, the Bridge Initiative, Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia, a lot of this information that you're hearing me talk about, if you go to bridge.georgetown.edu, bridge.georgetown.edu, you'll see a lot of coverage on this, all that I'm talking about, and studies of what's going on in countries, who are the key people in these countries that are promoting an Islamophobia, whose victims are not just extremists and terrorists, but are mainstream societies, because their message is that Islam itself, the very religion, is a dangerous religion, is a militantly oriented religion. So what we see as a result, you have, therefore, pundits, bloggers, authors, lobbyists, politicians, and agenda-driven anti-Muslim polemicists with significant funding. Studies have been done, for example, in America back 10 years ago, looking at and finding out that as much as, depending, one study, a major study by CARE, I think the amount was close to $213 million over a period of 5 to 9 years, I forget, had gone to individuals and think tanks and social media websites, and this was based, the documentation for this was based on what we call tax returns, IRS returns. That is, as with individuals, organizations have to file their income and how what the income goes to. Okay, so we're talking, more than $200 million at that point, some 10 years ago, had been going to these groups. Now, you don't see that kind of money going to groups that are saying the opposite. For example, what we do at Georgetown or our Bridge Initiative, there's nowhere near that kind of funding. I have to fund every year looking for funding. Just a few examples to see how Islamophobia is spread globally. If we look at France, in October 2020, there was a brutal murder of a secondary school teacher by an 18-year-old Chechen immigrant. The French Interior Minister called for swift measures against the enemy within. So it wasn't just the Chechen immigrant, it was the enemy within, a reference to France's Muslim community. Their religion, Islam, and culture was seen as a threat to, as it were, Western secular /secular Christian society. Under the banner of protecting the state from Islamic terrorism, French authorities launched a crackdown not just on extremists and terrorists, but also on the country's 6 million Muslims. The government carried out raids targeting Muslim civil society, marking 231 people for deportation, to be basically taken and sent out of the country, arresting dozens of others, classifying more than 50 Muslim associations for potential dissolution. Many French Muslims feared the government was weaponizing the killing to institute a government policy equating Islam with terrorism. And at some point, if there's a real interest in this, I can send this document that I'm talking from now. It's but I want to move through it and just give you a few sort of examples. In Austria, Austria seen as this Western capital that often hosted historically situations of, for example, between Iran and Europe and America, where there would be conversations would be held, in a country like Austria. Now, in Austria, 70 Muslim community leaders and academics, including one of the people that a distinguished professor that works for me on the Bridge Initiative, 70 Muslim community leaders and academics across the country had their homes raided by 900 police officers and special agents and other officials. 900 raided the homes of 70 Muslim community leaders in what was called Operation Luxor, named after an ancient city in Egypt. It was the largest coordinated police raid in Austria since the Second World War. And this was done by the government. The Chancellor Kurz then announced in November of 2020 a proposed law to make political Islam a criminal offense. Austrian authorities said the raid targeted people with alleged links to the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, etc. Of course, there's a presumption that the Muslim Brotherhood was an extremist or terrorist group, for example, which is, from my point of view, not true. Despite this allegation, after more than 2 years, not a single person was charged, but their homes were in the middle of the night raided by officers that had weapons drawn, in some cases knocking on or banging down a door, going in and frightening, obviously, the people, the children, seizing their computers, etc. And then their assets were frozen. Their access to banking money was frozen. Some of them, lost their jobs, etc. Now we move from Europe, just with those few examples, and there are many examples, one can say in virtually almost all European countries. But we go to China, and many of you are already aware of the fact that the Chinese government further entrenched its Islamophobia by spreading false information about the Uyghurs. And so you have more than 1 million Uyghurs, and some say that the figure is even higher than that. That's why I say more than 1 million, who basically were put into the equivalent of concentration camps. They call it re-education, in which the whole purpose of the re-education, these people were taken out of their homes, was to, in fact, so-called root them in their Chinese identity and block out the notion that they were Muslim in China, of Chinese and ethnic backgrounds. And so the Uyghurs were the ones that had to deal with this abuse. In response to being accused of genocide, the state launched a disinformation campaign, hiring social media influencers and content creators. The Chinese government entrenched Islamophobia by spreading false information about its treatment of Uyghurs, saying they were just re-educating them rather than they were prisoners. And often when somebody was taken out of the home, especially the husband, you'd have actually a government official who would then go in and live there and observe the family, how they were functioning. Another country is Myanmar. And there you see, the attack and the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. And more recently, in India, we see in India the extent to which you've had the discrimination against Muslims, the taking over of some mosques and building Hindu temples over them, the violence committed against Muslims, the shutting down of schools at times, the military and security forces have been very active in India, and everyone is looking at the current elections in which Modi will most probably be reelected, and he represents and has been a member of what basically is a militant Hindu nationalist organization. The growth of this so-called Hindutva, 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 religious nationalist policy, is that India is a Hindu country, and that, in fact, really the whole history of the Muslims has been one of subjugation and discrimination of Hindus. And now this was declared that India was a Hindu nation, and we've seen how it's impacted Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs. This is both in society, in schools, those that would be critical of the government, media people, etc. So you have violence. Now, I'll skip over authoritarian Muslim regimes, which we can talk about at some point, and their sort of form of Islamophobia, meaning a discrimination against Muslim institutions, such as social and political institutions that are not controlled by the government. And so they've practiced their own brand themselves, using and stoking the fear of a global Islamic threat, both at home and abroad, and therefore saying, well, you know, our criteria of outlawing these groups, or our criteria in legitimating a coup in Egypt, in which an elected government, you know, rather than waiting for the next election to see the Morsi government of the Muslim Brotherhood out, basically said the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist group, and therefore legitimated the military taking over. And in other countries, it's and we've seen, you know, more than 60,000 were imprisoned, many were slaughtered, tortured, you know, etc. And in other countries, you see the absolute state control over its brand of what they see as acceptable Islam, if you will. And then the final example is Islamophobia in Israel and Palestine. Islamophobia in Israel and Palestine is one of the least covered examples until very, very recently, with the not just the terror in terms of militant part of Hamas. I'm not talking about the political part of Hamas, but the militant part of Hamas and what they did in killing Israelis and in capturing. But also the realization and emphasis on the fact that what one began to see, and we now see, has grown to more than 34 to 35,000 Gazans, Palestinians, who have been killed, some 70% of which are women and children. That's taken a while, and so much so that what we've seen is we now see a number of situations in which people use the word genocide for what the Israeli government is doing. But here's a quote from a group that has been very involved, and it's a Jewish group, Jewish Voice for Peace, because it's not simply that all Jews support what the Israeli government and military are doing. That's not true at all. And here's the quote: Islamophobia plays a key role in building and sustaining public and U.S. government backing for Israel. So this is this Jewish Voices for Peace saying this. Right-wing Christian and Jewish groups dedicated to denying the fundamental rights of Palestinians deliberately fuel fear of Muslims and Arabs, commonly assumed to be Muslims, to push their agenda in Israel-Palestine, as well as the Middle East. Unwavering support for Israeli policies contributes to the characterization of Muslims and all Arabs as the enemy, and to the perpetuation of Islamophobia, or the failure to speak out against it. And sadly, we see this in Western governments, many but it's beginning to change. But we certainly see it in American foreign policy. President Biden has had a very unbalanced approach in terms of his support for quite a while, and uncritical support of Netanyahu in Israel, more recently becoming more critical in his approach, but still denying that there's a genocide going on, and still talking about support for Israel in terms of American aid. While he's held up the bombs, there's also been other kinds of aid that's been of a military nature that is given, and will do many, in some ways, will continue to be the case as far as we can tell right now. If you look at even his more recent statements, the idea of the ICC looking into Netanyahu and generating an arrest warrant, having the Secretary of State say it's shameful, and Biden denouncing it completely. And of course, the U.S. has never recognized the ICC, which also raises all kinds of questions about, the desire to be outside an international community investigation. So what you wind up with is a money Islamophobia Israel network bound by ideology, money, and the overlapping institution affiliations. It both furthers a rapidly anti-Muslim climate in the country and helps bolster the state-sponsored Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian policies adopted and promoted by the U.S. government. So where do we go from here? What we need is a new narrative. And we're beginning to see some of that, but we need a new narrative in which countries that have claimed, here the US and Europe, for example, and Canada, that they are democracies and believe in human rights, are more and more challenged about their consistent support often that they give to authoritarian regimes, and in this case, to the genocide that's going on. And I think that's why you see a number of countries beginning to question that. So you had a massive vote, what was it, 170 countries in the UN talking about and addressing the issue of genocide, and also the issue of we see the addressing of the question of a Palestinian state. Just the other day, we had news stories about Norway joining countries like Spain and others in basically recognizing in the very near future, very near future, the fact that Palestinians, that there is a Palestinian state within Israel. That's there, but I think that this, unfortunately, this war is going to go on. The other thing I should just end with is the incredible demonstrations that have been taken, public demonstrations that have been taken increasingly across the world. Increasingly across the world, not just at universities, but very much at universities, but also in the, if you will, in the public square. That is, broad swaths of citizens across the world, from America and Europe all the way over to Australia, who've been demonstrating, publicly against the continued war in Gaza. And so I'll bring that to a close and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Professor Jones, for your lectures on the global phenomena on the Islamophobia. And I would not give my own opinion or to make a conclusion, but if any of us have a question, please raise your hand. And before that, I will ask, here in our rooms, our vice rectors, Professor Yasir Yusuf, also joined us for this webinar, and our rector, Professor Ridwan Nurdin from the UIN of Takengon, also joined us. Professor Yasir Yusuf, are you there? Professor Yasir Yusuf? Professor Yasir Yusuf, maybe. Okay. If any of you want to ask the question, please raise your hand. But we have a question in our chat room now. Let me read it. That one question, Professor John. I believe our discussion today has shifted away from the topic of Muslims as terrorists, particularly in the light of the action taken by Israel in the Palestine, which I view as ethnic cleansing. Instead, our focus should be on how we can support Muslims in Palestine who are experiencing what many consider to be genocide. What are your thoughts on this matter, Professor Jones?
Yeah, I think that's yeah, it's a very good statement. And I would say, if, and hopefully nobody will be upset about this, that in my experience, often Muslims, like Christians, like non-even religious believers, when it comes to issues like the kind that we're seeing in Israel, but also other catastrophes, many are what I call couch potatoes. They sit there and they can't reach their wallet, and therefore take out their money and put their money where their mouth is, which is a phrase we have in America. And so those of us that are really concerned should be figuring out ways in which we can make a difference, depending on who we are. Those that have financial resources should be involved in supporting. Universities, et cetera, should be opening up positions. For the next 13 years, the education system in Gaza is destroyed. Okay, so universities should be opening up positions, providing scholarships for students to study there. I think mosques, churches, etc., should develop their own ways of responding in concrete ways. I think we all need to do that. Unfortunately, what many of us wind up doing, we become mesmerized and are looking at social media every day and public media every day, and we're upset and we argue about it, But I'm being very frank here. I used to do a fair amount. I'd be asked to do fundraising for Muslim organizations. And I remember doing one for a group where it was a small group of people at a dinner at night. The first thing I talked about was, well, when I got here, I saw a Mercedes, I saw a Lexus. And what I was communicating is, you're wonderfully successful people. But the point I made was, the question is, what can you then do? And sometimes what you would discover is people were happy to discuss the issues and denounce the people that they saw as the enemy. But when it came to really, supporting victims, and there are so many different ways that we can support international organizations that provide food and clothing, etc. It's a challenge.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Ridwan Nurdin, are you there? Do you have any questions? Professor Ridwan Nurdin, Director of UIN Ar-Raniry in Central Aceh. Okay, we have...
Yes, I am.
Yes, please.
I'd like to thanks Prof Jones Esposito. Yeah, we have remember your names is quite great in our community here. Thank you. Welcome. For the future of Palestine, actually, and the relationship between Muslim and Westerns, how can we predict to the future from now? We hope that there's a good relations, because in our community, what I experience here with the conflicts, not easy to rehabilitate from our society, for example. So I would like to know your opinion, how to attack this relationship in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, I think there are a variety, of ways. For example, Georgetown I think it's announced, or it's going to announce, it's developed a program with actually Indonesia, and it's going to be something where students will come from Indonesia to the U.S. and vice versa eventually. I think that there are all kinds of opportunities with this phenomenon that we're doing now. In the old days, in my career, I've traveled 3 million miles because I felt I had to make people see the center and what we did. I often kid and say I'm actually 38 years old. I just look a lot older because of the effect on my body. But the reality of it is we can do this virtual kind of, not just talks or lectures. You can wind up having, developing discussion groups that actually meet regularly and share something in common. So it can be professors, it can be students, but it also can be using the virtual to talk with and have government leaders, etc. It's easy when you've got virtual, no matter how busy somebody is, it's they want you to fly all the way there, whoever they are. But we can take advantage of this kind of phenomenon. So, I mean, I find myself since COVID, the COVID period, but even today, doing a lot of interview programs. I mean, doing this kind of thing, but also in all kinds of contexts. And it's just, it really is a phenomenal sort of situation. All I have to do is devote a small amount of time. I don't have to get on a plane and travel for ages, and then etc. So I think there's got to be a lot of creativity there. And one of the ways to do it is, for example, when this question is asked, ask it and then follow up with somebody. I mean, for example, when I go to answer something now, I'm right now answering spontaneously. If I sit back and think, I can look at situations and bring up more examples. I mean, one of the things that I've talked about is that there needs to be more of a response at a popular level, that individuals and institutions should, for example, be thinking about support for students, but for Palestinians to get a good education, to be able to come out and go to schools, to go to to Indonesia, to go to etc. I think that all of those things are real possibilities. It just takes people who will take the time to do that. And I certainly think promote programs. I mean, you're educators. The reason we had a center, but I created Bridge specifically. We now have 1.1 million followers. And I created it specifically about 8 years ago to deal with Islamophobia. But I have to do fundraising almost every year to raise money for that, so and very often, it's you want to say at times, it's your community, and we're all part of a community, but there needs to be, and I think that really is important. I mean, also, I think we're seeing more, but even at an educational level, the extent to which you all create programs so that people understand what you're doing in Aceh, and there isn't this stereotype about Aceh, that often exists, or that people know about the Muhammadiyah, or about, I mean, I've been following these organizations, and I knew Gus Dur, etc. But I can tell you this: when Gus Dur became president, somebody in the State Department called me, not because I was a big star in there. Somebody called me, and the level of his questions to me showed that they hadn't been following Indonesia at all. Another instance I met with informally for a different reason with somebody who is Secretary of State. And it was at a time when the U.S. was moving out of thinking about just the Middle East to Indonesia. And I asked him what he thought. And he said, very honestly, he said, I don't really know anything about Indonesia, but here's my staff member who's really, good. Okay. So I think that, Indonesia becomes an incredible example, not just that people know that it's the largest Muslim country, but it's what about it that, that needs to be out there.
Thanks, Prof. John.
We're doing a fundraiser for you right now.
Okay.
We should be doing a fundraiser. We have to arrange it. But go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, John. The next question is from Mr. Nurdin. Prof, is it true that the concept of Islamophobia was first introduced to Western by triple IT? Prof, does Islamophobia have anything to do with the Orientalism. What do you say about that one, Professor?
Well, I think Islamophobia has a lot to do with Orientalism.
Okay.
In fact, there was a book done by Oxford, and it was in. It was a Festschrift. It was a book in honor of me that they had a number of scholars that wrote, but the title had to do with, in fact, and there's a big emphasis in the West today, overcoming Orientalism, okay? Orientalism definitely framed Muslim countries, Muslims, and Islam as a religion, okay? Framed it in a way that really was driven by European and also American at a certain point, but European interest, the countries, etc., and that kind of image. Triple IT is not responsible for that, but Triple IT has been in the past, was a strong supporter in the early years that I established, particularly a great person and scholar, Barzinji. And so Triple IT was very supportive of our work and enabled us really to get going.
Thank you, Prof. John. The next question from Mr. Saifuddin Bantasam, a lecturer from the Syah Kuala University. And he wrote here, Prof, is there any possibility that Islamophobia will not appear in the US and various countries, but also, for example, in a number of countries that are called Muslim country or country with a large number of Muslims, such as Indonesia, Egypt, Malaysia, not only by non-Muslim, but also by fellow Muslim in this country. Do you see this as a threat to, or it is just an imagination?
Oh, I think it's a phenomenon. Hold on one second.
Yes. Oh, cool.
My puppy's scratching the door to come in and be with me, so I need to put him on the chair next to me.
That's okay. That's okay.
I think. See, I use the word Islamophobia when I look at some Muslim governments, and they decide what is acceptable Islam, what is an acceptable Muslim organization, etc. See, so I see Islamophobia in Egypt, okay? The way in which the head of the government and government policy approach things. The fact that what happened as a result of the Arab Spring was that many countries in the Middle East became concerned, rulers, about not that some people were going to come to their country, quote, militants, but that it would be an example or lesson, the change of government in Tunisia, the change of government in Egypt, that would feed popular forces within their countries. And as a result, they have wound up putting in policies which make it impossible to really have significant political participation.
Thank you, Professor Jones. This question from Mr. Teku Kemal Fasha, a lecturer from Unimals University in North Aceh. He wrote, after Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7 and Israel's subsequent bombardments and massacres of Gaza, the world has indeed changed. The world, especially the United States, has not been neutral and has made the Middle East situation is getting worse. Do you see is still the future of Islam as you wrote in in the 2010, professors?
I think that we're at a critical point in many countries. If you're talking about the U.S., I am somebody who preferred Bernie Sanders as in the last elections, but I supported Biden, etc. I think, though, that if I talk about interest, I think that the Biden administration has been very slow to really respond in recognizing and publicly recognizing what the Israeli government has done and their responsibility. And it's still not, its response about almost seeming that they're defending Netanyahu from an ICC, warrant for his arrest for what he's doing. I think that's of real concern. But worse than that would be if Mr. Trump wins. We know what Donald Trump did in the past, and very early in his running for office now, he said he's going to do what he did when he first came in and say that he wants to basically keep Muslims out of the country. His attitude about Islam and Muslims, I think, and the kind of security that existed during his administration is problematic. So I'm worried about that. I'm not the only person. We're worried about the future of democracy in our country. You look at a number of the people that we have now in Congress and in the Senate, and they're clearly, anti-Muslim and Islamophobes. You have the example of a Muslim judge who went to Harvard Law School, also went to Oxford, successful, appointed in government, and now Biden wants to appoint him to a higher office. And when he went before a committee dominated by these arch-conservative Republicans, all they wanted to ask him about is, how do you feel about Hamas? How do you feel about Israel? Which has nothing to do with being a lawyer. So I think we're going through a transition, and I think globally, the question of democracy globally is real democracy it's not where I thought it would be when I was young. I knew, for example, with Palestine and Israel, that in my lifetime, there would be a recognition of a Palestinian state and things would get better. And I used to feel sorry for people who were experts back then who were retiring and saying they're like doctors who work on a disease for a cure, and you finish your career and it's like there's no cure. Well, I'm a bit in that situation here.
Thanks, Prof. John. Herr Azmi, do you have any question want to ask? Please be short.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the chance, Professor. So actually what I'm going to ask is about the solutions and the countermeasures. And I believe that most participants here are educators and lecturers. So is there any education systems that we can reform to reduce this prejudice or the stereotypes to promote the understanding of the real Islam? And what sorts of effective measures that can be taken, probably by the governments, organizations, or even the individuals to combat this Islamophobia? Thank you.
Okay. Number one, I want you to send me an email, okay, saying with exactly what you said, okay, because I will try to see and get in touch with some people that I know about possibly creating a program, a virtual kind of program, where we not only meet once to discuss this, but where we brainstorm, okay? Because there's an awful lot that's important in terms of brainstorming. If we're trying to talk about change, whether it's in your country or my country, we need to start with what's going on in education. We need to be concerned about the dealing with these topics in our universities, and note how sensitive that's become. Okay, in America and Europe, that pride themselves on democracy and freedom of speech and human rights, note what's happened at universities when students have taken positions and demonstrated, etc. Okay, how very often the leaders of the university have responded, how very often the government has gotten involved. Okay, how very often multimillionaires have gotten involved. I think that what you're raising is something that is important, and we need to formulate it and then see if we can. I can't promise anything. I mean, I'm not, but and try to put together something where we actually explore this so that one is looking at issues which are really common to our countries, the basic issues, and getting that reality. Otherwise, where do we go? I mean, look at what happened in Tunisia. The example of Ghanouchi and Ennahda, and where that is all today. And certainly when we're talking about the immediate situation of Palestine and Israel. But we could do all kinds of, I think there are all kinds of possibilities.
Thank you, Prof. John. Before I read the next question, Professor Imtiaz, do you want to say something? Professor Imtiaz?
No. Go ahead. I'm enjoying to listen to what Professor John is saying.
Okay. Professor Yasir Yusuf, are you there? Okay, if not, I will read the next question. Prof, regarding the Palestinian issue, I saw that the students who demonstrated were labeled as leftists. Is the Islamophobic discourse in the Palestinian context now linked to the issue of the threat of that?
Some people there were other voices that came on. Could you just repeat that?
Okay, I will repeat it. Prof, regarding the Palestinian issue, I saw that the students who demonstrated were labeled as leftists. Is the Islamophobic discourse in the Palestinian context now linked to the issue of the communist red threat?
No, it's more linked far more to accusations of anti-Semitism.
Okay.
That in fact what people wind up saying is that pro-Palestinian demonstrators are actually anti-Semitic, not realizing that many of them are, people who are talking about the fact that they're objecting to the 76 years of subjugation of Palestinians, the apartheid state, and what's going on. And it's not that they are, against all Jews or against, et cetera, because in fact you do have, and I've seen statements from a fair number of rabbis. We have a number of Jewish groups that are active in campuses as well as nationally. So I think it's really the anti-Semitism rather than the kind of leftist use that you don't even see the word leftist used, the word. It's very much, saying, that what you're talking about are Israel haters, et cetera. The people that want to see a Palestinian state and see Israel disappear. In other words, it's the rhetoric that actually comes from Netanyahu and his cabinet, but that's being used in Western countries.
Okay.
I can only do one more question because my wife is going to be traveling to the airport, and so I can't. I wish I could stay longer, but so I can take one more question.
Okay, one last question. I think I will read it. Prof, is the acceptance of Sufism in the West also based on a certain degree of Islamophobic narrative to stop the threat of political Islamic movements? That's the last question.
I think that Sufism has become, has always, for a segment of America, has more and more people have become aware of it as a spiritual path. And certainly, for example, if we talk about Rumi and his writings, actually been among the top, as it were, authors within the United States, read by a variety of people. I think that, there are issues that some Muslims have with Sufism, but that's not for me to get into. I think Sufism, from my point of view, is a mainstream form of spirituality. Okay, but like in all religions, you get people who take the spirituality of a religion, and there are some who are phonies or a bit extremist. But I think that Sufism is a very, I mean, it's obvious, not only historically, but today, you know, and many people are both, they practice their Islam in a variety of ways. You know what I mean? They know it as a faith, they know its history, but it's part of their spirituality.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jones, for your great contribution for us in Indonesia, in Aceh especially, for your lecture on the global phenomena Islamophobia, and also thanks to Professor Ikhtias who bring us this discussion to our university in UIN Ar-Raniry, and for all of the participants who joined these webinars. Again, a million thanks for your joinings, and we hope we see you in the next webinars. And we believe, and I still pray that the peace still there in the Middle East, especially in Gaza. And we hope our Professor John, in good health. And we do, like you are our guru in Islamic studies. Some of them read the book, and tonight they saw your face directly in person, and they're very happy tonight. And we will record it, these webinars, and upload it in our YouTube channel in Banda Aceh, so they can enjoy. For those who cannot join this webinar. Again, Professor Jones, thank you.
I want to let me say two things briefly as I leave. Those that want to be in touch with me, my email is jle2@georgetown.edu. And the final observation is my mother and father saw me lecture once, and they asked people in the audience, how does it feel to see your son with this big audience? And my mother said, what do you think? And my mother said, at least he has a job. He has a job. I was worried. And then the second thing they said, well, did John read a lot? She said, all my boys read. But with John, he needed books with lots of pictures, lots of pictures. So nobody ever expected that I'd actually be writing books. Okay, take care. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you. Again, thank you. Semua teman-teman, terima kasih atas pertemuan malam ini. Thank you to Professor Imtiaz, and we have Professor Fathim Malkawi here. Maybe we next seminar we will invite. Again, all in all, thank you. बहुत-बहुत शुक्रिया. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bantu